This video is a brief introduction to ethnography. Ethnography may be a methodology you're familiar with. It's a long-standing methodology used by cultural anthropologists. So what is ethnography? The term itself comes from the Greek words ethnos, meaning people, and graphein, meaning writing about people. What ethnography focuses on are groups and what it is that those groups share in terms of beliefs, values, language that are stable and have developed over time. When we think about ethnography, we often think about exotic others living on islands far away, but in fact, much ethnography is done domestically. And so we can think about groups in different kinds of ways. The key characteristic of a group, though, is that it has something in common. So here are a number of examples. You can have a group that is coterminous with a nation or a region. It may also be a particular ethnic group. They may share some demographic features, political, economic interests, or have simply shared experiences. All of these are possible ways of defining a group that has a culture. And culture is the core concept when we think about ethnography. So what is culture? Well, there are many ways of thinking about it. These are common categories that we borrow primarily from cultural anthropology. Characteristics like social organization, customs and traditions, languages, art and literature, other artifacts that are created by cultural groups, and so on. The goal always when we do ethnography is to study a cultural group in some depth so that we understand it in a rich and nuanced kind of way. The cultural iceberg maybe gives a little bit of a sense of what it is that we're talking about when we talk about features of culture. And so you see the iceberg gives what we might think of as the surface features of culture, things that are obvious, we can see, the foods that people eat, the kinds of rituals that they engage in, the clothes that they wear. But there are also deep culture as well. These are things that are not necessarily obvious, but are part of what makes a group and are in fact of interest when we do ethnography. When we think about ethnography, the primary data collection is referred to as fieldwork, but fieldwork is a combination of a number of different ways of collecting data. It almost always consists of participant observation, as well as formal and informal interviews, and finding and analyzing cultural artifacts. These could be documents, they could be objects, photographs, and so on. A key thing to fieldwork is that the researcher participates, that's the participant observation, in the daily life of the group, and does so over an extended period of time. What the definition of an extended period of time is varies, of course, with the particular context of the research, but what is key is to think about how long one must be with a group of people to develop that kind of in-depth and nuanced understanding of what that group is about. We want to do so, of course, so that ultimately we can provide these rich representations of culture. So we create field notes that are based on thick description, that use analytic and narrative accounts of cultural groups. And you can see from the table on the right that ethnographic accounts can range across a variety of different types. From those on the left that really assume a realist perspective, that is, the writing represents what's really happening, to on the far right, a fictionalized ethnography using ethnographic data in a more storytelling kind of way. So there are these four characterizations that help you to see what it means to render a rich cultural representation, from the realist to an enhanced, semi-fictional, and fictionalized ethnography. There are a number of variations in ethnography that have developed over time, and I'll just briefly introduce you to four of them. Critical ethnography is an approach to ethnography that emphasizes working with and the emancipation of marginalized and disenfranchised groups. It takes as its intent to try and change society, assuming that all research is political and that its purpose ought to be to challenge the status quo. It is an approach where a dialogue with participants around their marginalization or disenfranchisement takes place, and is oftentimes an effort to try and help people overcome what might be their lack of awareness of their own marginalization. A good example of a critical ethnography is the classic work Paul Willis's Learning to Labor. Autoethnography is another variation on ethnography. It really is about taking at the center autobiographical and subjective experiences and writing about them, researching about them, thinking analytically about them, and connecting them to larger cultural, social, and political experiences. A good example is Carolyn Ellis's book, The Ethnographic Eye. Virtual ethnography, or what is sometimes called netnography, is another variation. And in the words of Kozinets, ethnography is conducted on the internet. It is an approach that adapts ethnographic techniques to looking at online cultures and communities that are formed through computer-mediated communication. So the context for research when we do virtual ethnography is the internet, social media, virtual gaming, apps, for example. Good example to look at if you're interested in this is Michael Vesch's book, An Anthropological Introduction to YouTube, where YouTube is the site of the ethnographic work. And then finally, visual ethnography. There are two meanings for visual ethnography. One is that it is the study of visual media and material like films or advertisements or YouTube videos. It also can mean using visual data and representation in ethnography. So good examples of that are photo essays or ethnographic films. A classic good example to see how this is done is Margaret Mead and Gregory Bateson's work, Balinese Character, where Bateson took the photographs and Mead wrote some accompanying text to go along with those photographs. And it's a simple representation of the development of Balinese character through photographs. So in terms of resources, there are many, many available. Ethnography is a long-standing methodology, and so there are a rich abundance of sources that you can look at. Certainly encyclopedias and handbooks are a good place to start if you're not familiar with this methodology, but you find many, many resources. I've given a link to a video in which 3 cultural anthropologists describe what fieldwork is. And each of them is in a domestic context and perhaps one that's not immediately obvious. And so it is a nice illustration of fieldwork. These 3 anthropologists are working in the context of artisanal cheesemakers, marine biologists, and Haitian refugees. So from these 3 different perspectives in what are really maybe not obvious contexts for doing ethnography, you can see what fieldwork looks like. And there you have ethnography.